Welcome to this journey into the forgotten corners of American history, where shadows linger longer than they should, and the past refuses to stay buried. I'm your host, and tonight we're traveling back to the winter of 1887, to a place that no longer appears on modern maps, a settlement that vanished from official records as mysteriously as the people who once called it home. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Right now, wherever you are, look around. Are you watching this alone in your room? Perhaps it's late at night or maybe early morning. Take a moment and tell me in the comments below where you are and what time it is as you hear this story. There's something profound about sharing these dark tales across time and space, connecting through the very mysteries that once destroyed entire communities. Your presence here matters. You're not just a viewer. You're a witness to what history tried to erase. Now let me take you to Hollow Creek, Missouri. A name that sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? But poetry has a way of hiding ugliness beneath beautiful words. In the winter of 1887, Hollow Creek was barely a settlement. Nestled deep in the Ozark Mountains, it consisted of perhaps 24 souls living in brutal isolation. The nearest town, Stillwater, lay 43 miles to the east, a 2-day journey on horseback through unforgiving terrain. When snow fell in those mountains, and it fell heavy that year, Hollow Creek became an island, cut off from civilization for months at a time. The Thornwood family had lived in those mountains for 3 generations. Isaiah Thornwood, 54 years old, was the patriarch, a man described in surviving documents as tall, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at you. His family, 23 people in total, lived in a sprawling colonial-style mansion that his grandfather had built in the 1820s. The house still stood, according to records, until a mysterious fire consumed it in 1891. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In December of 1887, a young man named Benjamin Garrett arrived in Stillwater. He was 28 years old, a reporter for the St. Louis Dispatch, and he carried with him a leather satchel filled with letters, 6 of them, each one a desperate plea from families whose loved ones had vanished along the mountain roads leading to Hollow Creek. 6 people, gone, in less than 3 months. The local sheriff, a man named Elias Crawford, had assured these families that their loved ones had simply moved on, perhaps headed further west, perhaps met with natural accidents in treacherous terrain. But Benjamin Garrett didn't believe in coincidences. He had interviewed the families, read the letters their missing relatives had sent before disappearing, and noticed something peculiar. Each person had mentioned in their final correspondence that they had been invited to stay with a generous family in the mountains during their journey. Each one had mentioned the name Thornwood, the temperature that December dropped to record lows. Benjamin's journal, which survived and is now housed in the Missouri Historical Society archives, records his first impression of Hollow Creek. Arrived at the settlement at dusk, smoke rises from a single chimney. The house looms against the gray sky like a tombstone. I feel watched, though I see no one. The silence here is not peaceful. It is the silence of held breath, of something waiting. What Benjamin Garrett discovered in the following weeks would become one of the most disturbing and controversial episodes in Missouri history. A story so unsettling that local authorities allegedly destroyed evidence, burned records, and did everything in their power to ensure that what happened in Hollow Creek would never reach the public eye. But fragments survived. Letters hidden in attics, diary entries sealed in courthouse basements, testimonies given decades later by those who lived through the horror and carried the weight of silence until their deathbeds. Tonight, we piece together those fragments. We reconstruct the timeline. We examine the evidence that history tried to bury. Because what happened in Hollow Creek wasn't just a crime, It was something far more disturbing. It was a ritual, a belief system, a family that had convinced themselves that their survival depended on acts so heinous that even now, more than a century later, the truth feels almost impossible to accept. But the truth, as you'll soon discover, has a way of clawing its way back to the surface, no matter how deep we bury it. To understand what happened in Hollow Creek, we must first understand the world that created it. The year 1887 was a time of transformation in America, but not all of America transformed at the same pace. While cities like St. Louis and Kansas City embraced industrialization, the Ozark Mountains remained stubbornly locked in an earlier century, a landscape where old ways persisted and isolation bred its own peculiar culture. The Ozarks had always been a refuge for those seeking to escape. After the Civil War, which had torn Missouri apart with a brutality that rivaled any battlefield in the South, families retreated into these mountains to avoid retribution, to hide from authorities, to live by their own rules. The Thornwood family was among them. According to county records from Crawford County, the Thornwood lineage traced back to Jeremiah Thornwood, who had purchased 800 acres of mountain land in 1823. Jeremiah had been a preacher, though his particular denomination remains unclear in historical documents. Some sources suggest he had been expelled from a Baptist congregation in Kentucky for doctrinal irregularities. Others hint at darker reasons for his departure. What we know for certain is that Jeremiah built his mansion far from any established settlement, and that his family thrived in isolation. The Thornwoods were largely self-sufficient. They hunted, farmed in the brief mountain summers, raised livestock, and traded rarely with the outside world. By 1887, 3 generations lived under one roof, a sprawling household governed by strict patriarchal authority. Isaiah Thornwood had inherited leadership of the clan upon his father's death in 1881. Court documents describe him as an educated man, literate and articulate, which makes what followed all the more disturbing. This was not ignorance at work. This was something else entirely. The winter of 1887 was historically brutal. The Farmer's Almanac from that year records that temperatures across Missouri plummeted to extremes not seen in decades. Snowfall in the Ozarks reached record depths. Roads became impassable. Communities that relied on trade found themselves starving. It was a winter that tested survival itself. But the Thornwoods seemed prepared, almost too prepared. In November of that year, a traveling merchant named Victor Hayes passed through Stillwater and mentioned in a letter to his wife that he had been invited to stay at a large house in the mountains to wait out an approaching storm. His letter, dated November 8, 1887, was the last communication his family ever received. He wrote, "The man who invited me, a Mr. Thornwood, seems educated and hospitable. He assures me his family has provisions enough to weather any storm. I am fortunate to have met such generosity in these remote parts." 2 weeks later, a young schoolteacher named Margaret Finemore disappeared. Her last known location, the road to Hollow Creek. Her diary, found months later in a creek bed 3 miles from the Thornwood property, contained a final entry dated November 23rd. "Accepted shelter from the snow. The house is larger than I expected. So many people living here. They all have the same eyes. I cannot explain it. The same watchful, hungry eyes." The page ended there. The remaining pages had been torn out. By December, Sheriff Elias Crawford had received formal complaints from 4 families. He made the journey to Hollow Creek once, in early December, and returned 2 days later with a brief report. Visited the Thornwood residence. Family appears healthy and well-provisioned. They deny any knowledge of missing persons, no evidence of foul play observed. But here's where the story takes a disturbing turn. Benjamin Garrett, while investigating in Stillwater, discovered something that Sheriff Crawford had failed to mention in his report. A local shopkeeper, a widow named Mrs. Hattie Brennan, told Benjamin that the sheriff had returned from Hollow Creek with a wagon full of supplies, fresh meat in particular, enough to last his own family through the winter. When Benjamin asked where the sheriff had obtained such provisions during a time of scarcity, Mrs. Brennan had simply looked at him and said, "He don't talk about it, but he eats well now. Him and his family. Real well." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Benjamin Garrett recorded in his journal, "I am beginning to suspect that the isolation of Hollow Creek has bred something more than mere eccentricity. There is a cooperation here, a network of silence that suggests complicity. But complicity in what? And how far does it reach?" The Thornwood household, according to the 1880 census, consisted of Isaiah Thornwood and his wife, Rebecca, their 7 children ranging in age from 6 to 23, Isaiah's 2 brothers and their families, his elderly mother, and several cousins. 23 people total. An unusually large household, even for rural standards of the time. Neighbors, though few and distant, described the Thornwoods as reclusive but not unfriendly when encountered. They attended no church, they participated in no community gatherings, but on the rare occasions when they came to Stillwater to trade, they were polite, well-spoken, and paid in cash or valuable furs. One detail appears repeatedly in various accounts. The Thornwoods never invited anyone to their home, except, it seems, during the winter of 1887. A local farmer, Tobias Merrick, told Benjamin Garrett about an encounter he had with Isaiah Thornwood in October of that year. Isaiah had stopped at Merrick's property and asked quite directly whether Merrick knew of any travelers who might be passing through before winter. When Merrick asked why, Isaiah had smiled and said, "We enjoy company during the dark months. It helps pass the time." Merrick found the request odd, but thought nothing more of it until people started disappearing. As Benjamin Garrett dug deeper, he found fragments of a belief system that the Thornwoods seemed to follow. In a letter confiscated from the estate years later, Isaiah had written to a distant relative, "Father taught us that the flesh is merely a vessel. In times of need, when God tests us with deprivation, we must remember that all sustenance is holy if taken with gratitude and purpose. The body returns to the earth, the spirit ascends, and we, the living, must endure." The letter's date, October 15th, 1887, 3 weeks before the disappearances began. Benjamin Garrett arrived at the Thornwood estate on December 18th, 1887. The journey from Stillwater had taken him 3 days through snow-choked mountain passes. His horse had nearly collapsed twice. By the time he saw the mansion rising through the pine trees, darkness was falling and the temperature had dropped below 0. His journal entry from that evening is worth reading in full. "The house is a monument to isolation. 3 stories, colonial architecture, but weathered and dark as if the mountain itself is slowly consuming it. Every window glows with firelight, and smoke pours from 4 separate chimneys. I can see shadows moving behind the windows, many shadows. They seem to be gathering in the main hall. I hear singing, hymns perhaps, but in a melody I don't recognize. The words are indistinct, but the rhythm is unsettling. It rises and falls like breathing." Benjamin approached the front door and knocked. The singing stopped immediately. Footsteps approached from inside, multiple sets, but only one person answered. It was Isaiah Thornwood himself. Contemporary descriptions paint Isaiah as an imposing figure, tall, well over 6 feet, with a thick dark beard shot through with grey. His clothing was formal, almost ceremonial, a black suit despite the rural setting. But it was his eyes that witnesses consistently mentioned. Benjamin wrote, "His eyes are pale, almost colorless. When he looks at you, it feels as though he is measuring something. Not your character, but your substance, your weight, your utility." Isaiah welcomed Benjamin with what seemed like genuine warmth. He ushered him inside, took his coat, and led him to a sitting room where a massive fire roared in a stone hearth. The interior of the house was surprisingly refined. Bookshelves lined the walls, oil paintings hung in gilded frames. A grand piano stood in one corner. This was not the home of ignorant mountain people. This was the home of people who had chosen isolation deliberately. "Mr. Garrett," Isaiah said, his voice deep and measured, "we don't receive many visitors, especially in winter. To what do we owe this unexpected pleasure?" Benjamin explained his purpose carefully. He was investigating the disappearances. He meant no accusation, but the missing persons had all mentioned the Thornwood name in their final letters. He simply wanted to ask if the family had seen any of these travelers. Isaiah listened without expression. When Benjamin finished, there was a long silence. Then Isaiah smiled. "Mr. Garrett, I appreciate your dedication to your profession, but I'm afraid you've made a difficult journey for nothing. We have seen no travelers here. The road past our property leads nowhere. Why would anyone venture this far into the mountains with winter approaching?" It was a reasonable question, but Benjamin had already noticed something that troubled him. On the wall behind Isaiah hung a woman's coat, brown wool with distinctive brass buttons. Benjamin had seen a photograph of that exact coat. It had belonged to Margaret Finemore, the missing schoolteacher. He said nothing about it, not yet. Instead, he accepted Isaiah's invitation to stay the night. The snow was falling heavily again, and returning to Stillwater in darkness would be suicidal. That evening, Benjamin was introduced to the family. 23 people gathered for dinner in a long dining hall. The table was laden with food, an almost obscene abundance given the scarcity that gripped the region. Roasted meat, potatoes, preserved vegetables, fresh bread. Benjamin noted in his journal, "They eat well here. Better than anyone I've seen in Missouri this winter. Where does such plenty come from when the land is frozen and trade routes are impassable?" He was seated next to Abigail Thornwood, Isaiah's eldest daughter. She was 19, with dark hair and her father's pale eyes. Throughout the meal she barely spoke, but Benjamin felt her watching him constantly. At one point she leaned close and whispered, "You shouldn't have come here, Mr. Garrett." Before he could respond, Isaiah raised his glass and called for silence. "Tonight," he announced, "we give thanks for Providence, for the sustenance that sees us through the dark months, for the gifts that arrive when we need them most. Let us remember that all flesh is grass and all its beauty like the flower of the field. We are but vessels, Mr. Garrett, temporary vessels for an eternal purpose." The family repeated in unison, "We are but vessels." Benjamin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. After dinner, he was shown to a guest room on the second floor. The room was clean, well appointed, but the door had no lock on the inside. He pushed a chair against it anyway and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. He could hear movement throughout the house, footsteps in the hallways, whispered conversations. At one point, he heard what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor above him. At midnight, he heard singing again, that same strange hymn, rising from somewhere below, perhaps the basement. He went to his window and looked out across the snow-covered grounds. In the moonlight, he could see a path leading to a large barn about 200 yards from the house. Smoke was rising from the barn. Why would they heat a barn in the middle of the night? Benjamin made a decision that would either save his life or end it. He had to see inside that barn. He waited until 2 a.m., then carefully moved the chair and opened his door. The hallway was dark and empty. He crept down the stairs, avoiding the ones that creaked, and slipped out through a side door into the freezing night. The walk to the barn felt endless. The snow came up to his knees. His breath formed clouds in the air. He kept expecting to hear shouts behind him, to feel hands grabbing him, but the house remained silent. When he reached the barn, he found the door slightly ajar. Warm air poured out, carrying with it a smell that made his stomach turn. Copper and rot, sweet and sick-making. He knew that smell. Every reporter who had covered the war knew that smell. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse. Benjamin pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The barn had been converted into a workshop of sorts. Tables lined the walls, hooks hung from the ceiling beams, and on those hooks hung cuts of meat neatly butchered, wrapped in cloth, curing in the cold air. So much meat, hundreds of pounds. But it was the table in the center that stopped his breath. On it lay a leather satchel, split open, its contents spilled across the wood. Papers, letters, a diary with a name embossed on the cover, Margaret Finemore, and beside it, laid out with almost surgical precision, were personal effects. Pocket watch, a pair of spectacles, a wedding ring, a man's hat, items that had belonged to different people, trophies, evidence, proof. Benjamin heard a sound behind him and turned. Abigail Thornwood stood in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her pale eyes catching the lantern light. "I tried to warn you," she said softly. "Father knows you saw Mother's new coat. He knows you're not here by accident. And once you know, Mr. Garrett, you can never leave." Behind her, shadows moved in the snow. The entire family was awake, and they were coming. I want to pause here and ask you something. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Do you believe Benjamin Garrett escaped? Do you think the authorities were truly involved? And what do you think was in that barn beyond what we've described? Your theories matter. This is not just a story. It's an investigation that continues even now, and your insights might reveal something we've missed. Benjamin didn't think. Instinct took over. He grabbed the leather satchel from the table, stuffed Margaret Finemore's diary into his coat, and ran. Not toward the house where the family was gathering, but deeper into the woods behind the barn. The snow slowed him down, but adrenaline pushed him forward. Behind him, he heard voices calling, not shouting, calling, almost singing, the same hymn from earlier, but now it sounded like a hunting song. He ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. His lungs burned in the frigid air. His hands were numb, but he found salvation in the form of a small cave, barely visible beneath an overhang of rock. He squeezed inside and pressed himself against the cold stone, trying to control his breathing, trying to make himself invisible. The voices passed nearby. He heard Isaiah's deep tone. He cannot have gone far. The cold will bring him back, or the cold will finish what we started. Either way, Providence will decide. They moved on. Benjamin waited, in that cave until dawn, shaking violently from cold and terror. When grey light finally filtered through the trees, he emerged and began making his way east toward Stillwater, using the sun to guide him. It took him 2 days to reach the town. He had frostbite on 3 fingers and both feet, but he had the satchel, he had the diary, he had proof, or so he thought. When Benjamin stumbled into Sheriff Elias Crawford's office on December 21st, he found the lawman sitting by a warm stove, eating a breakfast of bacon and eggs, fresh meat, in the middle of a famine winter. The sheriff looked up and his face went pale. "Mr. Garrett," Crawford said slowly, "I heard you went up to Hollow Creek. I also heard you didn't come back." Benjamin slammed the satchel onto the desk. 6 people, Sheriff. 6 people disappeared, and I found their belongings in that barn. Margaret Finemore's diary, Victor Hayes's pocket watch, Evidence of murder, of something worse than murder. Crawford didn't move. He simply stared at the satchel as if it were a coiled snake. "Where exactly did you find this, Mr. Garrett?" "In their barn. They've been killing travelers. They've been—" Benjamin stopped. He couldn't say the words, couldn't articulate the full horror of what he suspected. The sheriff stood slowly. He walked to his office door and locked it. Then he turned back to Benjamin with an expression that was part pity, part warning. "Mr. Garrett, I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to listen carefully. Then you're going to get on your horse and ride back to St. Louis, and you're never going to speak of Hollow Creek again." Benjamin stared at him. "You knew. You've known all along." Crawford sat down heavily. "Those mountains, Mr. Garrett, they're old. Older than this country, older than our laws. Things happen up there that don't follow the rules we live by down here. The Thornwoods, they've been there for generations. They have an understanding with the land, and an arrangement to murder people, to survive." Crawford snapped. "Do you know what happens when winter comes and you have 23 mouths to feed and no way to get supplies? Do you know what people are capable of when they're starving? The Thornwoods, they don't kill randomly. They wait. They're patient. They only take those who come willingly, those who accept shelter." Benjamin felt sick. "You're protecting them. Why?" Crawford opened a drawer and pulled out a wrapped package. Even from across the desk, Benjamin could smell it, cured meat. "Because they share, Mr. Garrett. When times are hard, when people in Stillwater are starving, the Thornwoods provide. They keep this town alive, and in return, we keep their secrets." The implication was monstrous. The entire town was complicit. The entire town had been eating. Benjamin grabbed the satchel and ran. He didn't stop running until he reached the boarding house where he'd left his horse. He rode south, away, from Stillwater, away from Hollow Creek, and didn't look back. Benjamin Garrett never published his story. The St. Louis Dispatch received his resignation letter in January of 1888. He moved to Chicago and never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed. But he kept the diary, Margaret Finemore's diary, and before his death in 1923, he donated it to the Missouri Historical Society with instructions that it be sealed until 1950. When researchers finally opened that diary, they found something that explained everything and nothing. Margaret Finemore had written her final entries not as a victim, but as a witness to something far more complex than simple murder. She had been kept alive at the Thornwood estate for 3 weeks. She had observed, she had recorded, and what she recorded was a family operating under a belief system so twisted that it defied comprehension. Her entry from November 25th, 1887. "They call it the Sustenance Covenant. Isaiah explained it to me today as if I were a student learning theology. He says his grandfather, Jeremiah, received a vision during the harsh winter of 1831. The family was starving. They had buried 2 children already. Jeremiah prayed for guidance, and in his prayer he received an answer. That all flesh is sacred, that no vessel should be wasted, that in times of great need, God provides in unexpected ways." The entry continued. "A traveler had died on their property that winter. Natural causes, Isaiah insists, pneumonia. But the body was there, and the family was starving. Jeremiah made a decision. He told his family that the man's death was providence, that his flesh would not go to waste, that they would honor his sacrifice by surviving through it." Margaret's handwriting became shaky here. They ate him, the entire family, and they survived the winter. And Jeremiah declared that this was God's will, that when travelers come to their door in times of need, they come as angels of providence, unwitting sacrifices to sustain, the chosen. But here's where the horror deepens. Margaret recorded something that even she seemed to doubt. "Isaiah showed me records, a ledger kept by his grandfather, then his father, Now him. Every winter for 56 years they have practiced this covenant, but only when necessary, only when the snows are heavy and isolation is complete. They don't hunt people, they wait, they invite, and those who accept, those who stay, become part of the cycle. The ledger, if it existed, was never found, but Margaret's descriptions of it were detailed. Names, dates, how each person had arrived, how they had been honored. The Thornwoods didn't see themselves as murderers. They saw themselves as practitioners of a sacred duty, a family chosen to survive at any cost. Margaret's final legible entry, dated December 1st, was the most disturbing. Abigail came to my room tonight. She's different from the others. There's doubt in her eyes. She told me that her mother had tried to leave once, years ago, when Abigail was a child. Rebecca had wanted to take the children and run, but Isaiah convinced her to stay, not through force, through belief. He made her believe that leaving would mean damnation, that their survival was tied to this place, this covenant. Abigail said, "I've never known anything else, but sometimes I dream of a world where we don't have to do this, where we could just be a normal family." Then she cried, and I realized something terrible. They're prisoners too, prisoners of a belief that has become their identity. The entry ended there. The remaining pages had been torn out, presumably by Benjamin when he fled. But what Margaret had recorded was enough. This wasn't a family of mindless savages. This was a family that had constructed an entire theological framework to justify the unjustifiable. They had ritualized murder, made it sacred, passed it down through generations as if it were a cherished tradition. The story of Hollow Creek might have ended there, buried in sealed archives, if not for what happened in March of 1888. A late-season blizzard trapped the Thornwood family in their estate for an additional 6 weeks. By the time the snow melted, something had changed. A traveling preacher named Reverend Thomas Whitmore passed through Stillwater in early April and mentioned that he had visited a large estate in the mountains where he had seen something troubling. His testimony, recorded in the Stillwater Methodist Church records, is brief but significant. "I was invited to provide religious counsel to a family named Thornwood. When I arrived, I found the household in a state of distress. The patriarch, Isaiah, seemed fevered, speaking in tongues about fulfillment of prophecy. His daughter, a young woman named Abigail, begged me to take her away from that place. She whispered things I dare not repeat, about practices that violate every law of God and man. I left before nightfall. I was frightened." Reverend Whitmore reported his concerns to Sheriff Crawford, who predictably dismissed them. But 2 weeks later, something unprecedented happened. The Thornwood estate burned. The fire was visible from Stillwater, 43 miles away. A massive conflagration that lit up the night sky on April 22, 1888. When a group of townsmen finally made the journey to investigate, they found the mansion reduced to ashes and stone foundations. The barn had burned too. Everything was gone. But here's the detail that has never been explained. No bodies were found, not one. 23 people had lived in that house. The fire had been so hot that it melted glass and warped iron, yet no skeletal remains were discovered in the ruins. It was as if the family had vanished into smoke. One witness, a farmer named Jacob Pritchard, claimed he had seen figures walking away from the burning house the night of the fire. He counted them. 23 silhouettes moving into the mountains, into the darkness, never to be seen again. But the most disturbing discovery came 3 days after the fire. A young boy playing near the ruins found a cellar entrance that had been hidden beneath the main house. Inside, investigators found what can only be described as a shrine. The walls were covered in writing, carved directly into the stone. Biblical passages mixed with something else, a strange script that no one could decipher, and in the center of the room, A pit, deep and dark, leading down into the mountain itself. Sheriff Crawford ordered the pit sealed. He told investigators it was just an old well, but one man, a deputy named William Foster, disobeyed orders and climbed down into that darkness. What he found was never officially recorded, but in a letter to his brother, dated May 1888, Foster wrote, "There are chambers down there, rooms carved into the living rock, and in those rooms evidence of their covenant. Bones, so many bones, some old, crumbling to dust, some fresh, and symbols on the walls, pictures of figures, standing in circles, of offerings being made, of something rising from beneath. I cannot describe the feeling I had in those chambers, as if the mountain itself was watching me, as if I had disturbed something that should remain buried." The pit was sealed with concrete and rubble. The site was officially declared dangerous and off-limits, and Hollow Creek disappeared from maps. The settlement name was erased from county records. The land was designated as wilderness, unsuitable for habitation. But stories persisted. Hikers who ventured into those mountains reported finding foundations of the old Thornwood estate. Some claimed to hear singing on cold winter nights. Others spoke of finding small piles of stones arranged in circles, as if someone still visited the site to perform rituals. In 1934, during the Great Depression, 2 hunters stumbled upon a cave system deep in the Ozarks, not far from where Hollow Creek once stood. Inside, they found evidence of recent occupation: blankets, canned goods, and carved into the wall a single phrase: "The covenant endures." Time has a way of burying secrets, but it also has a way of unearthing them. The story of Hollow Creek should have ended with that fire in 1888, the sealed pit, the erased records, the silence imposed by fear and complicity. But history, like the dead, refuses to stay buried forever. The first significant discovery came in 1952, more than 6 decades after the Thornwood estate burned. A team of surveyors working for the U.S. Geological Survey was mapping previously uncharted sections of the Ozark Mountains when they stumbled upon the ruins. The lead surveyor, a man named Robert Dalton, filed an incident report that still exists in the National Archives. Dalton wrote, "We discovered stone foundations of what appears to be a large residential structure, approximately 3 stories based on remaining chimney height. The site shows evidence of catastrophic fire. More concerning is what we found in the basement level. Despite official reports stating the site was sealed in 1888, we found the cellar entrance partially open. Someone or something had moved the rubble aside. Fresh tool marks on the stones. Recent disturbance of soil. Against protocols, Dalton's team descended into the cellar. What they found contradicted every official statement made about Hollow Creek. The pit, supposedly sealed with concrete in 1888, was open. The concrete had been broken apart from below, as if something had pushed its way up through the seal, and in the chambers beneath they found evidence of continued occupation. Dalton's report includes an inventory: preserved food containers dating from the 1930s and 1940s, clothing items, a child's doll, remarkably well preserved, and most disturbing, fresh ashes in what appears to be a ceremonial fire pit. The ashes were analyzed later and found to be less than 3 months old. The team also discovered journals, 3 of them hidden in a metal box sealed with wax. The journals were written by different hands, spanning different decades. The first was dated 1891, just 3 years after the fire. It was written by someone who signed only as A.T. The entries were brief and cryptic. Father was wrong about the prophecy. The winter did not last forever, but the covenant does. We left the house to burn. We descended to the old places, the places grandfather Jeremiah found when he first came to these mountains, the places that existed before any Thornwood. Who set foot here? We live differently now, not in the light, but we live. The second journal dated from 1923. This one was more detailed, written by someone who identified herself as Sarah Thornwood, daughter of Abigail. The realization hit researchers hard. Abigail, Isaiah's daughter who had shown doubt and mercy in Margaret Finemore's diary, had survived, had continued the line. Sarah wrote, "Mother tells me stories of the old house, of a man named Benjamin who tried to expose us, of a time when we lived among people, pretending to be civilized. But Mother says civilization is the real pretense, that beneath every society, every law, every moral code, there is only one truth: survival. She taught me the covenant as her father taught her, and I will teach my children. We are the keepers of an ancient understanding. We do not apologize. We do not repent. We endure." The third journal was the most recent, dated 1948. It was written by someone calling himself Isaiah III, named for the prophet. He wrote about a changing world, about wars that had consumed nations, about atomic bombs and the death of millions. And then he wrote something chilling. "The world above judges us for what we do to survive, but they have done far worse. They have industrialized death, made it systematic, efficient. At least we honor those we take. At least we make their sacrifice meaningful. The world calls us monsters, but we have seen the real monsters, and they wear uniforms and build camps and drop bombs from the sky. Who are they to judge the covenant?" The journals were classified immediately. The site was officially declared a hazardous area and fenced off. But the discoveries continued. In 1967, a graduate student in anthropology at the University of Missouri named Patricia Chen was researching isolated Ozark communities for her dissertation. She interviewed elderly residents of Stillwater, now a dying town itself, barely more than a few dozen people. One woman, 93 years old, agreed to speak on the condition of anonymity. The woman, identified in Chen's notes only as Mrs. K, had been a child in Stillwater in the 1880s. She remembered the Thornwoods. More importantly, she remembered the fire. According to Chen's transcripts, Mrs. K stated that the fire was not accidental. She claimed that Isaiah Thornwood set it himself, that he gathered his family and told them the time had come to return to the depths. She said her father, who had been one of the men who investigated the ruins, told her that Isaiah had been preparing for this moment for years, that the cellar and the chambers beneath were always the true home. The house above was merely for show. When the attention became too dangerous, when outsiders like Benjamin Garrett started asking questions, Isaiah decided to disappear completely. Mrs. K also revealed something that official records never mentioned. In the weeks before the fire, several townspeople from Stillwater had gone missing. Not travelers, local residents, people who had asked too many questions about where the Thornwoods got their provisions, people who had threatened to contact federal authorities. "They made examples," Mrs. K said. "My father told me that after the fire, after the Thornwoods vanished, Sheriff Crawford called a town meeting. He told everyone that what happened at Hollow Creek was over, done, buried, and anyone who spoke of it again would meet the same fate. We all understood. The Thornwoods were gone, but their influence wasn't. Even from wherever they had gone, they still had power over us." Patricia Chen attempted to publish her findings. Her dissertation was rejected by her academic committee. The recordings of her interviews mysteriously disappeared from the university archives. She was advised to choose a different research topic. She refused and was subsequently denied her degree. In 1969, she left academia entirely. But before she did, she deposited copies of her research with 3 separate historical societies under sealed instructions. The most recent discovery occurred in 1983. A photographer named Michael Torres was documenting abandoned structures throughout rural Missouri for a book project. He obtained permission to photograph the sealed site of Hollow Creek, believing it to be just another ruin with an interesting history. Torres took over 200 photographs over 3 days. Most showed exactly what one would expect: crumbling foundations, overgrown vegetation, remnants of a forgotten past. But 3 photographs showed something else. In the background of these images, barely visible in the tree line, were figures, human shapes standing motionless, watching. Torres didn't notice them while shooting. He only saw them when developing the film. He enlarged the images. The figures were dressed in dark clothing. Their faces were obscured by distance and shadow, but there were 7 of them, standing in a line, watching him photograph the ruins. Torres reported the presence of squatters to local authorities. When rangers investigated, they found no one. But they did find evidence of recent activity: a campfire carefully concealed beneath the ruins, food waste buried but recent, and carved into a stone near the sealed cellar entrance, fresh marks that formed words. The watchers remain, the covenant endures. We are still here. The site was sealed again, this time with concrete barriers and warning signs declaring it federal property. But hikers still report strange occurrences in that region: singing heard on winter nights, figures glimpsed between trees, and every few years someone goes missing in those mountains. The official explanation is always the same: harsh terrain, sudden weather, tragic accidents. But there are those who know better, those who have studied the pattern, who have traced the disappearances and noticed that they only occur in winter, that the victims are always traveling alone, that they were last seen accepting help from strangers who offered shelter from the cold. In 2003, a retired FBI agent named Raymond Foster, grandson of Deputy William Foster, who explored the chambers in 1888, published a self-funded book titled The Hollow Creek Legacy: A Century of Silence. In it, he presented evidence suggesting that the Thornwood bloodline never truly ended, that descendants, operating under different names, might still be living in the Ozarks, that the covenant, whatever its true nature, continues in some form. The book was dismissed as conspiracy theory. It sold fewer than 500 copies, but those who read it found his evidence compelling. Census anomalies, patterns of disappearances, strange land purchases in remote areas, and testimonies from people who claimed to have encountered members of a secretive mountain community that practices old ways. Foster died in 2007. His files were donated to the Missouri Historical Society. They remain sealed at the request of his family, scheduled to be opened in 2050, exactly 100 years after Benjamin Garrett's cache was unsealed. What will they reveal? We can only speculate. But one thing is certain: the story of Hollow Creek is not over. It merely continues in darkness, waiting for the next person curious enough or foolish enough to go looking for the truth. So, what really happened at Hollow Creek? What became of the Thornwood family? And perhaps most disturbing of all, are they still out there, somewhere in those mountains, practicing their covenant in the darkness? After more than a century of investigation, fragmented evidence, and suppressed testimonies, we are left with theories, not answers. Theories, each one as unsettling as the last. Theory 1. The family perished in the depths. Some researchers believe that the Thornwoods descended into those chambers beneath their estate and never emerged. That the fire was indeed their final act, a symbolic destruction of their worldly existence before, retreating into the mountain to die. The journals found in 1952 could have been written years earlier, left behind as a kind of testament. The figures photographed in 1983 could have been anyone: squatters, hikers, shadows playing tricks on film. According to this theory, The Thornwood bloodline ended in those dark chambers, their bodies still lying in unexplored tunnels, their covenant dying with them. But this theory doesn't explain the fresh ashes found in 1952. It doesn't explain the broken concrete seal pushed open from below, and it doesn't explain the pattern of disappearances that continues to this day in those mountains. Theory 2. The descendants adapted and dispersed. The second theory suggests something more insidious, that the Thornwood family, or at least some members, survived by abandoning their identity, that they emerged from those chambers not as Thornwoods, but as different people with different names, that they dispersed throughout the Ozarks, perhaps throughout Missouri and beyond, carrying their beliefs with them, but practicing them more carefully, more secretly. This theory is supported by census anomalies that Raymond Foster documented, families appearing in rural areas with no prior records, isolated households that refuse contact with authorities, and the persistent reports of small, insular communities in the deep Ozarks that maintain practices outsiders are never permitted to witness. If this theory is true, the covenant didn't end. It evolved. It became more sophisticated, more careful, more hidden. The Thornwoods learned from their mistake. They learned that visibility brings scrutiny, and they learned to disappear in plain sight. Theory 3. Something else took root in those mountains. The third theory is the one that keeps researchers awake at night. It suggests that the Thornwood covenant was never truly about survival, that it was about something older, something that existed in those mountains long before any European settlers arrived, that the chambers beneath the estate weren't built by Jeremiah Thornwood, but discovered by him, that the symbols on those walls, the ones that no one could decipher, came from something far more ancient than a twisted Christian theology. According to this theory, the Thornwoods didn't create their covenant, they found it. They stumbled upon something in those mountains, something that had been waiting, and it consumed them, changed them, made them into something between human and something else. And when they descended into those chambers in 1888, they weren't hiding. They were returning home, to whatever had called to them from the darkness. This is the theory that official channels refuse to acknowledge, the theory that gets papers rejected and careers destroyed, because if it's true, then Hollow Creek wasn't an isolated incident of human depravity. It was a door being opened, and once a door is opened, it's very difficult to close. To this day, no one knows the truth about Hollow Creek. The site remains sealed, the files remain classified or mysteriously lost. And every winter, when the snow falls heavy in the Ozarks and the mountains become impassable, people still go missing. Not many, perhaps 1 or 2. Just enough to maintain a pattern, just enough to suggest that something or someone is still out there, still practicing rituals that predate our understanding of right and wrong. Benjamin Garrett never published his investigation. He carried the weight of what he witnessed until his death in 1923. His final words, recorded by his daughter, were simply, "I should have stayed in that cave. I should have frozen to death. Better that than knowing what I know." What did he know that we don't? What did he see in that barn beyond the evidence he documented? The diary he kept was extensive, over 200 pages, but only 37 pages survived. The rest were destroyed, reportedly by Benjamin himself. What was written on those missing pages? We may never know, but we continue to search, we continue to investigate, because the truth, however dark, deserves to be found. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of America's darkest and most disturbing mysteries. If this story has affected you, if it has made you think about the nature of survival, morality, and what humans are truly capable of when isolated from society, I want to hear from you. Share your theories in the comments below. Do you believe the Thornwood still exist? Do you think the covenant was real or just the justification of desperate, evil people? Your voice matters in our haunted community. If you enjoyed this deep investigation, please subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We explore the forgotten horrors of American history, the stories that were buried for good reason but deserve to be remembered. Next time, we'll be investigating another case that challenges everything we think we know about human nature. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. This is your host, signing off. Sleep well, if you can.